let's talk about cussing. Cussing is pretty normal, pretty formally regularized, formally regular to find within the youth, adulthood, senior citizens. Everybody cusses from time to time, at least most of the time, at least most people. I had a bit of a internal monologue with myself with last week's episode, because I debated how I was going to carry myself and how I was going to present this iteration of Robert to the world. Because, I really wanted, to be a distinction between me and this, whatever this personality that I'm, sharing you this mask, And I found it really attractive to maybe not cuss as much until I realized that it was going to probably feel a little bit, it was going to feel much more tiring, always having to filter out all the cussing or the natural, emotional dialect that I want to share with you when I'm talking about, very passionate subjects on the show. So it kind of felt, well, I guess it's more important for me to feel more comfortable with myself when I'm making these episodes. This probably, at least I'm aiming for this entire, this passion project of mine to aim, a little bit more from, the relatable personal side. I don't want to be, hiding as much. I just want to kind of be myself. Because, as I mentioned previous in other episodes, well, only in the other one episode that I made, I've had other YouTube channels in the past where I'm very used to, strictly, mandating myself to a particular, speech impediment, certain topics, vocabulary, vernacular, so on and so forth, fancy words, blah, blah, blah. And, I kind of just want, Robert's Roulette to just kind of be myself, Furthermore, I started thinking about, fuck, shit, bitch, what have you. Crap, I don't care. I'll be more open with myself, but I was thinking about, swearing kind of has lost all of its meaning nowadays. Everybody does it. So you kind of have to look back. You kind of have to look back at. I relate it a lot to how swearing is used on BoJack Horseman. If any of you guys watch that show or are familiar with it, excellent show. My favorite animated TV show of all time. But anyways, subject for another time. BoJack Horseman always saved the F-bomb for very emotionally powerful moments throughout the show. They only used it once per season. They used it 6 times, actually. And it was pretty powerful, By the 3rd or 4th time that you hear the F-bomb being dropped in BoJack Horseman, you can tell it's because it's, some fans even correlate it to how the F-bomb is always used to indicate the destruction of one of BoJack's relationships with somebody in his life, with Herb Kazaz, Todd, and, oh my god, there's this deer's name. I can't really remember her name. If you've seen the show, you know what I mean. The scene where, BoJack almost has sex with an underage girl. What? Who said that? Gotta watch the show. The show is great, by the way, but it's a little disturbing, as you might have told. My English is not perfect. My apologies. I hope you can be patient with me on that. Anyhow, and I used to not swear as much. That's my thing. And now I do. Because I'm becoming, much more assertive, I would say, in the past few years than I was, say 5 or 6 years ago. Which, inherently doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't mean, doesn't mean that I'm the best person. Doesn't mean that I'm any worse of a person. I'm really stupid, I know. But, it kind of I feel like I'm disappointed in myself. With, cursing not really a bad thing. It can, like I mentioned, it can be helped to really, personify raw passion, throughout vocabulary. That's why they were always, blacklisted from, the general language or any other words. Like, oh, you can't use those words until, the situation, demands, aggressiveness or degrading or maybe, stupid driver, like, oh, fuck that little bitch. It's like, it's meaty, it's punchy. But I kind of miss myself when I was a little bit more PG. because inadvertently, it might be, deep down, the little conservative part of my brain kind of misses, the innocence or, the formal gentlemanly way of talking that I used to have. And I really do miss that, because I feel the more I've grown, the more I've, discovered more about myself, learned more about myself. I've realized, sometimes growing up means, doesn't necessarily mean to growing up to the best version of yourself. Just finding out who you aren't. And sometimes you got to experiment. Sometimes you got to do things that, are out of your zone. Sometimes you got to do things that you normally wouldn't do. So it's much more healthy and much more responsible for yourself, I feel, to know what you do and do not like, what's you, what isn't you, by experimenting, by living a little bit, instead of, leading life out of fear, assumptions, prejudice, because, that's just going to cause more harm. You're going to be stuck with the subjective perspective of a lot of, experiences, people, subjects, out of fear. You're not actually talking about anything meaningful. You're just judging because you didn't live. You didn't allow yourself to live. You know what I mean? And I found myself, much more social in the past few years. I've been meeting a lot more people lately. I've been opening myself up more. I've been, learning the ropes of, social interaction, which is something that I've always strived to, perfect. I mean, you can't really perfect something like that. Nobody's an expert on anything, but, it's nice to, finally be, having friends, having a lot of friends, having acquaintances, friendly interactions at work, people actually, asking you genuinely, how are you doing? What's up, Robert? How's it going, Robert? It's cool, it's cool, finally feeling part of, of a community, or, having deep emotional connections with friends and family, and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, you're exposing yourself to various, situations that can mold or influence you, at least inherently or at least subconsciously. And swearing is definitely, a byproduct of, a lot of abrasive, aggressive, petrifying scenarios where people are swearing up and down like it's, they literally popped out of their mother's vagina and they were saying the C word, the F word, and so on and so forth. So on and so forth. And I kind of miss cussing when it meant something, at least to me personally. It doesn't bother me when people cuss. It actually, funny enough, it actually used to really make me uncomfortable. Like when people would curse. I'm not talking about like, oh, this was like a couple of years ago. No, when I was a toddler, basically, I was like, don't say that word, don't say that, but the Lord wouldn't approve. And the more I've grown up and the more that I've learned about myself, I kind of like the idea of going back to, a clean version, because at the same time, without removing easy shortcuts to accentuate emotions or situations, it forces you to, use different words. And I kind of like that about myself. I have in my, in my native language being Spanish and English. Well, fun story. I was born in Mexico, but my childhood, I was raised in the States. So Spanish hasn't really been my native language my entire life, but it's currently, now that I'm back living in Mexico, it's a language that I have slightly more knowledge or understanding, or, knowing how I can speak a little bit better in Spanish than what I can in English, as you probably have already noticed. And obviously, Spanish is a pretty vulgar word, vulgar language, especially in Mexico, especially where I live. It's like 4-year-olds, man. It's insane. But it's the way things are. It doesn't really bother me. Well, it doesn't bother me at all. It used to bother me. But I kind of, giving that subjective narrative purpose to cursing is something that I really I really find attractive to try to go back to. Obviously, it's, it would be rewiring my brain because I'm so used to saying curse words in English and in Spanish on a day-to-day basis. And it's something that, I'm trying to work on. I'm trying to, whittle a little bit down to a point where when you see Robert saying the word fuck, bitch, shit, it means something. Was this fulfilling? Was this interesting to hear? Absolutely not. Anyways, next subject.